Right, guys and girls, in that last session we had a little bit of an introduction to the challenge of pricing a property and my thoughts on that, and I hope that sort of shed a little bit of light as to where I'm coming from. And from that point there, I just really want to go on and tell you about a system of pricing properties that I was one of the first agents, if not the first agent, to use in Western Australia way back in 1992. And that back then it was called price ranging. And it was pretty radical at the time, and a lot of people went, Geoff, you're on drugs using such a method. However, I held to it, and after a few initial challenges, it began to work for me. And what I want to do today is tell you why it worked and how it's evolved, the challenges over the years that we've used it, and why today I believe it's one of the best opportunities to get buyers to properties that is in existence in the marketplace. So let's go back to where we were. The typical situation is that people put a property on the market, the property's worth say 500,000, 510,000, and it ends up going on the market as high as 550, 560. But let's be generous and say the property that you and the seller have agreed is worth 500 to 510, the seller wanting 510, goes onto the market at 540. So the problem with that is that if you've got a fixed price on a property, especially if it's in that situation, 8 or 10% over the top, there's very few buyers that are going to be attracted to it. And the ones that do come to look at the property are buyers that are more likely, taking into account what we said before about buyers usually looking low but eventually paying more. The buyers that come in at 540 are buyers that are probably going to buy a property at up to 600,000 and at least 580. So they're going to come in and look at that property, not like it, and go, well, no, we want to see something better. You're getting the wrong buyer pool into your house, into your listing, and that's not a healthy thing. Or, worse still, you're getting no one into your listing. And the old thing is that a house that's attracting no viewings is a house that's overpriced. On the other hand, a house that's attracting a whole heap of viewings of people that aren't buying or buyers that aren't putting an offer in is also overpriced. There's no argument about that. So no viewings, overpriced. A lot of viewings, no offers, overpriced. So what the challenge is to attract the right people to the property. The way to do that, keeping in mind what we discussed in the last session, and that is the likely buyer that's going to pay 500 and 510 initially starts out looking where? Around 8 to 10% below. So we'll say in this case that buyer is circling houses in the paper around the 460, 480 mark, but certainly not putting circles around properties in the paper or printing off brochures from online of properties that are asking 540. So what we've got to do is bring that seller and that buyer together. Now this is really important. Pricing a property is not about selling it. People often say, if I price this property right, that price is going to bring me an offer. And that's not true. You can put whatever price you like on a property, but the problem with that is that if the people come to the house and don't like it, they're not going to buy it. So buyer feedback ranging is exactly what it says. It's an opportunity to put a property in a wide range to attract a wider market segment of the market to the property, so they can give you some feedback as to what they think it's worth. Now initially the initial reaction is that everyone will offer the lower end of the range. Well, let me tell you, I've been using this method of selling for around 20 years, and that hasn't been my experience. So let's discuss some of the aspects of this system and how it works. Now, keeping in mind that if you put that fixed price on a property, and I hope you can see this screen because we have decided to do this on the spur of the moment, you can see there, and if you just concentrate on the funnel, even if you can't read the words, that funnel is very narrow, isn't it? So if you put a fixed price on a property, my argument would be that you're only going to get the odd person through if you're lucky, and your level of inquiry is going to be a lot lower. So hopefully you've been able to see that. The whole intention of buyer feedback ranging is to widen the funnel so that you're getting a lot more inquiry. Now, keeping in mind that, let's concentrate on that property we're talking about that's worth, say, 500 to 510,000. We'll say that the seller has put that property on the market at 540, and hopefully not too many people out there watching this video will argue that that's not a typical situation. 500, 510 expectation, on the market at 540. So already we're up against it. We're overpriced and we're restricting opportunities for people to actually come and look at the property. So the actual asking price isn't doing its job. It's not attracting inquiry. So what happens in that situation is the property's on the market for, say, let's say that we've got a gap here between the likely buyer, if you like, and the likely seller of around $80,000. So looking at 460 initially, probably going to pay 500, 510, but unfortunately not going to look at a house that's on the market for 540. So what we've got to do is bring them together. So in a nutshell, what tends to happen is that over time that person who's asking a fixed price at 540 slowly comes down in price, sometimes taking weeks and weeks and weeks. Typically, on the market today, it's taking people 8 to 10 weeks to get to a point where they're attracting the right buyer. Now, meanwhile, the buyer that started looking at 460 slowly lifts their game to eventually they're up around the 490, 500, and they're saying, okay, now we're starting to see what we like. But unfortunately, it's not necessarily that house that's being reduced that they buy. They've often gone off and bought another property. Whereas, if they'd have seen this house in the first place, it may have been the house they buy. Many times I've had buyers say to me, I would have bought that house if I knew they were going to take that. But unfortunately they were asking so much more that we didn't think we were in the ballpark. So it's often the case that the seller's missing out, the buyer's missing out, and of course if the seller and buyer are missing out, who's not getting paid? Us guys, agents. So, you know, being a person who'd like to get paid back then when I was selling full on, I decided to find a better way. And I was introduced to this idea of price ranging, they called it back then. However, I thought a better term for it, and we changed to this term some time ago as buyer feedback ranging, because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get a massive buyers through to get as much feedback as possible so that you can give that feedback to the seller, and so that these people, these buyers, can come through the property and actually see it. Because it's very hard for a buyer to see a property and fall in love with it if they don't come through the door. So the whole intention of buyer feedback ranging is not to sell the property, but to attract people to the property. Now, you'll get some of the do-gooders around the place saying it's paid advertising. Well, I'm going to challenge you. What type of advertising isn't paid advertising? Every time you put an advertisement in the paper, aren't you trying to encourage people to make an inquiry and actually say, yes, I'd like to have a look at that property? You know, you describe the property in the best way possible, and you price it in such a way that you hope that people will ring up. You know, the success prevention officers, the SPOs, would say that that's paid advertising. Well, they can say what they like. At the end of the day, I've been using it for 20 years and it works. So let's go a little bit further and say, instead of going through that whole that pain period of 4, 6, 8, 10 weeks, and sometimes losing the listing, because just when you're getting it to the right price, the listing runs out and another agent comes along and lists it and sells it, and you've done all the hard work. So, you know, you've got your moose head on the wall, if you like, with all the blood running down, and another agent comes in and says, oh, that poor bugger, what happened to him? Lists the property on the basis of all the work that's been done and sells it. Has that ever happened to you? If it hasn't, you must be pretty new, because it certainly happened to me a few times in the early days. But I got very cunning and wise and said, I don't like that happening to me, so I'm going to price my properties to sell. Now, let's cut a long story short, put it in perspective. We've got a situation here where we've got a property that's instead of priced at 540, we're going to price this property 460 to 540. Now, immediately into the heads of most people, they go, oh, everyone will offer 460. Well, let me overcome a couple of objections. The seller says to me, Geoff, if we go 460, 540, everyone will offer me the low end. And I say to them, that's my challenge, not yours. If people come through and offer 460, at least they're there. But if they fall in love with the property, and I say, look, we put it in this range of 460 to 540 for no other reason than to get feedback, but at this early stage, Mr. Buyer, we're not going to accept the low end of the range. We're going to wait for 4 to 8 weeks to get as much feedback as possible. And in that time, if somebody decides to make a reasonable offer, then we'll accept it. But we're not going to make a decision on what we actually think it's worth until we get a sufficient feedback. So how much do you like the property? Now, let me tell you from my experience, once somebody sees a property and falls in love with it, they're going to break your arm if you try and stop them from buying it. It's all a matter of price. They'll want to negotiate.